Good afternoon. Welcome to topic 3 in MM467, the psychology of doing wrong. We look at a number of different theories first, and then we look at the particular sources of psychological components that limit how far people who are not that moral in the first place attempted to do wrong things. In looking at this sort of area, the area of what makes people do wrong or do right, a fundamental concept is the concept of locus of control. The psychology of ethics, in fact, rests on that idea, the idea of locus of control. The locus of control is the belief that you have as to whether things are under your control or whether you're more at the mercy of forces outside of yourself. People with an external locus of control view their actions as largely determined by outside forces, circumstances, people, and fate. It's other people's fault, it's not your fault, you're the victim of circumstances. People with an internal locus of control view their actions as essentially their own responsibility and see themselves as drivers of their own destiny. They can still be amoral or psychopathic, though. And business people tend to be internal rather than external because you go into business to make a difference, whether it's just to make a difference to your fortune or your family. You have to put in a lot of effort. You wouldn't be putting in a lot of effort if you thought it could be overturned by forces beyond your control. So business tends to attract, and the professions around business, such as financial advising, tend to attract people whose locus of control is more internal. Now, it's not a simple matter of everybody's one or everybody's the other. This is one of those things where people could be internal for some contexts, external for others. But we're particularly concerned with what your locus of control is for your career, your job, your work. The modelling of making decisions, one of the big models comes from game theory. Game theory is particularly attractive to people who are in level 1 or level 2, Kohlberg, where they're selfish and they want to get the best information they can as to whether they're likely to win or lose in a particular situation, particularly a negotiating situation. But it is a theory, it's a set of ways to behave in the theory. So in order for game theory to work for you, you've got to have pretty good and accurate information about the odds of things happening and the costs and rewards of going one way rather than the other. The ideal game is in what's called a Nash equilibrium. That's a set of strategies that provide incentives for a player to maintain his strategy given the other's expected strategy. Like laws nobody would want to break, even if the police didn't enforce them. But some games, some situations where you're bidding and in competition aren't equilibrium games. That is, they don't tend to a stability in the end. They can be volatile and go the other way. So it's really important to know what kind of game that you're in. Is it one where it's stable in the end? Economics thinks that most things end up in equilibrium. Demand and supply end up in equilibrium in classical economics. But in the stock market, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes we get the herd carrying people away and things get more and more volatile. Next thing. In game theory, a critical idea that is useful in making business decisions is the idea of the zero-sum game. In a zero-sum game, there's no incentive to cooperate at all in the first place because every set of outcomes you can think of has one party gaining at the other's expense. A zero-sum game is one where all the resources, all the assets, all the pie, so to speak, is limited, and you can only quarrel about who gets more or less of a fixed pie. Whereas what people want in business and what people claim business does is create win-win outcomes where everybody can get what they want because the pie itself, the resources themselves, grow. So there is a big, big, basic difference between people who see the world, especially the business world, as a zero-sum game and people who see the business world as a positive-sum game. And when it comes to looking at ideas like adding value, we are in the world of the positive-sum game. So game theory can be applied to any situation of competition or cooperation between you and others. You have to draw up a payoff matrix, which shows the outcomes of choices for you as against the others. You are the first row and the other is the second. The left column shows one choice, the second another choice. Going to illustrate this in a second. The simplest matrix has only two people and only two outcomes, a 2x2 game. So, for example, the prisoner's dilemma, as it's called, two people suspected of plotting to rob a bank. The police set it up so that if one confesses but the other doesn't, the latter may get 12 months in jail, but the confessor just gets a caution. If both confess, both get 8 months in jail. If both keep silent, both get a month. So if you're one of the two suspects, what you do depends on what you think the other one will do. But notice that the outcomes aren't evenly balanced. So here we can put the outcomes in a payoff matrix. You keep quiet. That's the left-hand column. You confess. That's the right-hand column. The other party is quiet, that's the first row. The other party confesses, that's the bottom row. And the outcomes are the jail terms. The first bracket is you, the second bracket is them. So you want one of the two zeros. You confess, but the other one keeps quiet. Or you keep quiet and the other one confesses you don't want. But both of you will get a jail sentence if you're in the both quiet or both confess. So that's a prisoner's dilemma. And the choice entirely depends on those figures. So its application to real life is only to those situations where you can put some sort of figure, or at least some sort of really strong contrast between doing one thing and doing another thing. Prisoner's dilemma situations are exemplified by whether to have the first strike or not in a nuclear war, in a contest or in a battle. What will the other side do? If they won't strike back, it might pay us to drop a bomb on them. If we're sure they'll strike back, it might pay us not to do. Other examples, imposing a tariff on another country's goods before they impose one on you. And if they're sure to retaliate, and most of the time they are, then is it worth you imposing a tariff in the first place? Then advertising before a competitor does. Believe that the first mover has the advantage in advertising. Usually true, not always. Imperfect competition generally, where you're competing on brand and not just on price. Adam Smith, held that if everybody follows their own self-interest, then the market will make sure that the general interest of society is held. And how it does that is because you can't actually sell your stuff unless you sell it at a reasonable price that people are prepared to pay. It's almost as simple as that. Next thing, traffic lights. If you both ignore them, you could crash into each other and die. If one ignores them and the other one doesn't, then either or both of you could still die. So the only win-win situation there, a good solution to this example of a prisoner's dilemma, is where both of you obey the lights, as of course most people actually do. So that's the game theory. Now we come on to fraud. Forensic accounting is accounting looking at crime and trying to discover what's been stolen and who's done it, detecting fraud and dishonesty in particular. That's done in accordance with the law of evidence, and the law of evidence says that evidence has got to be direct, documented, like closed-circuit cameras or actual written documents. It can't be hearsay. The fraud of crime includes forgery, embezzlement, stealing from your employer, theft, also known as misappropriation, embezzlement's a kind of misappropriation, deliberately lying in order to obtain a pecuniary advantage, that is a kind of theft, and fraud itself is a kind of theft. Theft is the big general term, fraud is the next level down. But in financial advice and in accounting, the particular kind of theft that we're most likely to come up against is fraud, which is deceitful misrepresentation of the facts, either by omitting something or by telling a direct lie. The crime of fraud. Resources must have been stolen or misappropriated. If there's been no misappropriation, there's been no fraud. The perpetrator must have known that the resources weren't his or hers. So the knowledge of the perpetrator has got to be proven. And the evidence about the previous 2 points, beyond a 95 probability, has to apply. In other words, you have to establish those 2 facts beyond reasonable doubt. And if all 3 criteria above are met, the crime of fraud is proven. If not, it's only suspected. With crime in common law jurisdictions, you have to convince a jury or a judge that the thing happened beyond reasonable doubt. That means 95% probability that it did. A big theory about why people commit fraud is in the fraud triangle model. 3 causes quite widely agreed to need to be present to enable fraud to occur within a firm. Motive and rationalisation. Motive, a drive to commit fraud. Somebody's got to want to do it. You can't accidentally commit it. You must have the intention to deceive. And rationalisation, that's the excuse you make for committing it. Motive and rationalisation can be the same, or they could be different. You have one motive to do it because you're very hungry and you need money immediately, and then after you've done it, the rationalisation is that the firm wouldn't even miss it. So they don't have to be the same, but they often are. The second ingredient is opportunity, that there has to be a way of your getting hold of the resources, forging a signature, getting the papers when the boss is away, intervening in the computer program and software in order to manipulate them, and you have to have the means, you have to have the technical expertise or the physical expertise to do the job. The 3 elements are what's called the fraud triangle, which is a triangle of causation. And because it's a triangle of causation, it's not about the crime. It can lead to the crime, but there's no need for this to be a 95% probability, because we're looking at whether somebody has probably committed fraud or not. To get them in the court successfully accuse them of fraud, we've got to establish that their guilt applies beyond reasonable doubt. When somebody does something wrong, something against the codes, they will justify and rationalise. And somebody very clearly justifying or rationalising their actions is probably in a state of mind where they realise that they've done something wrong. These two words don't mean the same thing. Justification differs from explanation because with justification you're trying to avoid criticism. It's associated with external locus of control. It's not my fault, blah, 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 circumstances made me do it. Politicians and adverts do it in most public presentations, that is, use justification, excuses. Utilitarianism facilitates it. Why? Because utilitarianism is about producing the greatest good of the greatest number, and therefore you justify that it might hurt the minority, but that doesn't matter because the majority benefit by more than enough to compensate it. Survivalism facilitates it, that is, the belief that it's okay to do something that would otherwise be wrong if survival depends on it. Survival in the micro sense of my survival, or survival in the macro sense of the whole of civilization. Okay to block major motorways and stop people getting off trains at rush hour because otherwise they won't listen to the urgent messages of the climate lobby like Extinction Rebellion. And so that's a different kind of survivalism facilitating justification. Psychopaths and sociopaths use justification in contempt of the audience. They tell you what they say they're really committed to, and they're not at all. Justification is associated with fear of punishment, in that if you're not afraid of being punished, why bother to make excuses in the first place? And the US police often use justification, particularly in Black Lives Matter types of contexts, where they shoot first because the suspect put their hand in their pocket, and so the police say, we thought they were going to shoot, so we had to shoot first. That's an example of a justification. Rationalisation is after the event, and it's where we try to make a bad action seem more rational than it actually was. External locus of control again, we say we had little choice in the matter. For example, if we don't sell arms to bad country A, somebody else will, so we may as well be the ones who make a profit. That's a rationalisation. Everybody's doing it, so why shouldn't we? What might everybody be doing? Hoarding toilet rolls during the pandemic. That's an example of that. And if everybody's doing it, it can't be that wrong. That's the idea there. Not really stealing because they didn't even miss it. Embezzlement and shoplifting, that's the rationalisation that you would often hear in that context. Eugenic murder to improve the racial gene pool, such as what the Nazis in Nazi Germany did in the 1940s. Exterminate whole subspecies like Mongol kids on the basis that what's then left is a superior gene pool to create a superior race. And the other one is a rationalisation such as Biden used on Afghanistan. If he hadn't pulled out the troops, then it would have been even worse later. So we say, yes, it was a mess, yes, it was bad, but if we hadn't acted then, it would have been even worse later. Rationalisations. So rationalisations and justifications are examples of people doing the wrong thing and trying to reduce the possible shame, opprobrium or punishment they may get for having done the wrong thing. Now we come on to guilt and shame as the two things at the individual level that can be associated with doing wrong, and the two things at the individual level that people will try and avoid, and that's why they're more likely to do right than wrong, because they really don't want guilt and shame. Guilt. Guilt is internal and it's a feeling. You feel guilt. Shame is external and it's shown. It's felt as well, but you display shame. If locus of control is internal, then guilt arises from a sense of failure to curb impulses admitted to be bad. So, for example, you're on a diet or you're trying to give up smoking, but your urges got the better of you and you pigged out on food, or you took a quiet drag on the fag, so to speak, and then you feel guilty afterwards because you failed to control your impulses. And you didn't like that feeling, so you're less likely to do those bad things again because you remember what it felt like to feel guilty. Then there's guilty conscience, which is certainly very effective in preventing somebody doing a wrong thing twice. But to have a guilty conscience, you first got to have an active conscience. And so it only applies to those people, hopefully most of us, that actually do have consciences. Feeling guilty means feeling that one has done something wrong, and that's not possible if you're a psychopath or a sociopath, because if you're a psychopath or a sociopath, you don't believe you ever do anything wrong. Or worse still, you believe maybe you do something wrong, but there's nothing wrong with doing something wrong. If you feel there's nothing wrong with doing something wrong, then by definition, you're a psychopath. Then if locus of control is mostly external, the guilt that you would feel is letting down the side, letting down the team, letting down the gang, etc. Guilt is powerful, but it does require that you've got something like a conscience or some other internal receptor with which to experience guilt in the interests of the external world and the general public. Shame is about losing face. It's an essentially social phenomenon rather than a psychological one. It's important in all societies, not just Asian ones where everybody knows face is important. It's a very effective regulator of behaviour for people with external locus of control. Shame is triggered by being discovered, not by doing the wrong thing in the first place. It's the discovery that's crucial in causing shame. Shame could be brazened out if somebody's got a very, very strong internal locus of control. For example, Johnny Depp with allegedly abusing his partner, Donald Trump for allegedly trying to overthrow American democracy, Vladimir Putin for more or less anything you care to mention, Boris Johnson for casually reinventing laws and getting away with broken promises to Ireland and Northern Ireland over Brexit, the English comedian Jimmy Carr, who was caught red-handed money laundering and evading taxes, and he said, OK, fair cop, but I expect you to stop me doing it. Can't expect me to stop trying. And Woody Allen, in almost every situation, but notoriously when one of his adopted daughters and him eloped, leaving Mia Farrow to fend for the others. And he said, well, you can't help what love does to you, which is almost the opposite of what he said in some of his own films. So you can brazen out what would otherwise be shame if your locus of control is very strong. But when it's as strong as that, you're on the edge of psychopathy. And maybe that's not such a good thing to identify with. In Kohlberg 3, where peer group pressure is the primary driver of ethical behaviour, shame is a primary weapon for keeping people in line. So it's also primary for the professions. Being caught out in unprofessional behaviour, being called out for unprofessional behaviour, makes somebody ashamed, and that's supposed to be quite powerful in keeping people in line. Risk-seeking. People do wrong, more men than women, although of course it's changing as we move forward into a more enlightened future. But historically, thrill-seeking and risk-seeking tend to be more male things than female things, historically. Gang norms, in a gang, you do daring things in order to get the respect of the gang, and you may have to do uncomfortable, painful things by way of initiation to get into a gang or to get into a college or fraternity in America. And the thrill there is surviving what was at risk. There's the buzz of adventure and survival, bungee jumping, for example. You wouldn't do bungee jumping unless you wanted to put your survival at risk and you wanted the deep thrill of getting away with it. Fooling the system and the authorities isn't bungee jumping, but it's a kind of mental or spiritual bungee jumping, the thrill of getting away with it. People who haven't ever tried to get away with things probably can't imagine how deep and sharp that thrill is. The trouble is that you get away with it once, you try it again, get away with it again, you try it a third time, hoping for the thrill, and you don't get away with it, and you get all the punishment, shame, guilt, and for that matter, possibly jail time and fines that results from not getting away with it. It's said that when freedom's at risk, you appreciate it more. Whether that's true or not depends on what you're like, I think. The high chance of getting away with it is sharper than the ache of being caught for people who are risk-seeking. Then there are people at the other end of the spectrum who have nothing to lose, and if they've got nothing to lose, they'll risk themselves, they'll risk being caught, just because they feel, rightly or wrongly, they feel they've got nothing to lose. Then there's mania. That could be naturally manic, aggressive, active, or it could be fueled by drink or drugs. And when you're in a manic mode, you'll probably be more likely to do wrong things and make wrong decisions and be antisocial than when you're not in a manic phase. I'm not implying that people who are bipolar are antisocial in their manic phase. Some of them are very pro-social in their manic phase. But just that mania is a thing that does cause antisocial behaviour, including fraud and crime, in quite a few cases. And lastly, there's the simple, what Nietzsche and for that matter Freud and Adler, the psychologist, called the will to power. If you are determined to have power, whether it's in your family, in your firm, in the country, in your party, then that's quite like seeking risk. You will take risk in order to get power because you value it so much. It's not like an addiction, but it has somewhat similar effects. You must have it and you take risks to get it. Rational crime reasoning, that is, excuses, rationalizations. We're not now talking about natural urges and drives. We're talking about what your calculations say. So you could say survival trumps legality, that is, I will break the law in order to give my family things to eat, and so it may be illegal, but survival's more important than that. Next one. It's better to go to jail than to have the shame of being a grass. So I might not dob in somebody I know committed a crime or a fraud because I am so determined not to be seen as a grass that I will instead be prepared to go to jail for it. Next one. Bad law isn't a law at all. We remember the Latin quote from the first lecture. This is a tax evasion excuse. I shouldn't be paying such high tax. I contribute to the prosperity of the country. Therefore, I will relocate my headquarters in a very low tax haven in, for example, the Caribbean. That is a rationalisation. And then there's a quotation from very famous poem called Paradise Lost by John Milton, written in the 1640s, I think. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Some people's psychology is such that they would rather be the boss of a bad situation than be an ordinary member of a good one. I have a sense that there are more people like that these days than there used to be, but I may be wrong. Then a quotation from a favourite song of mine, a jazz song by Annie Ross. The quotation is, "Right gets you nowhere." That's following the philosophy of Machiavelli, who says right is simply an invention of the powerful in order to stop people realising themselves and getting power. That's a rationalisation, because it's quite clear to anybody who looks at it that there is some real value in the idea of right and pro-social behaviour, and there is such a thing as society. So you can't simply say there is no such thing as right. It's just not true. You can say it gets you nowhere because you're that selfish or that much after power, but that's just you. Next one, all codes are written by the victors of some previous battle. Well, most of them are, like the entire Catholic religion in Latin America, imposed by Spanish and Portuguese conquerors in the 1500s. But that doesn't mean that all the religious tenets and the ideas of right and wrong in the Catholic Church, especially not the ideas of people like Thomas Aquinas, are wrong just because the Spanish conquerors happened to be Catholic. That would be what we call throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So that's another excuse. Next thing, ethics are relative. Ethical relativism is true. So ethics are geographical phenomena. So if I don't like where I am because they don't allow me to do what I want to do, I'll move somewhere more appropriate. And in sexual behaviour in particular, there are big differences between countries about what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so people who are criminalised or victimised in a country because of their sexual preference can move to the more liberal, usually more Western countries in order to indulge their true nature or their preference, whatever the case may be. And lastly, my mum always forgave me, so why shouldn't people forgive me in the future? Stalin and Hitler were examples of people who had doting mothers who never disciplined them for doing anything wrong, and the results were that they didn't think anything they ever did was wrong, and even if it was, they would be forgiven for them. And that applies both to Hitler and Stalin. So there's a certain danger in spoiling your kids. You don't have to smack them, that's quite taboo, but if you spoil them, there is the risk that they will grow up to be psychopaths or sociopaths, antisocial, and make other people's lives a misery. Okay, that'll do for now. There is a little bit more to say on that, so I might do a separate recording talking about other psychological aspects in a day or two's time. But that's it for now. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.